Welcome everybody to the Vinny Eastwood Show. So sorry for being a little bit late. We'll be getting underway in just a few seconds on the backup stream. In the meantime, I'm just going to give my little obligatory plug for Behind the Green Mask, UN Agenda 21 by Rosa Corey. And there we go, backup stream is going. So here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinny Eastwood Show, the lighter side of genocide. Just because we're being exterminated doesn't mean we can't make it fun. Otherwise, what's the point of being killed? The Vinny Eastwood Show, where the only thing worse than living in a high-tech global police state is Vinny's jokes. And my very special guest is Dr. Bob Melamede. Bob, where are we getting you calling in from today?
I'm in Burlington, Vermont, in my living room.
All right. And the reason why we've got Bob on today is because of his knowledge working with Dr. Rick Simpson. May as well be, but he's cured more people than any doctor anyway, about the amazing effects of cannabis on cancer and various other things. And this is how we actually got to know Bob in the first place. And just before we begin the interview, though, ladies and gentlemen, I do want to remind you that this is a listener-supported broadcast. It does not exist without your help. So if you can, please go to thevinnieeastwoodshow.com. That's Vinny with a Y because it's the most important question. And Eastwood, like, go ahead. Make my news. And go ahead, ladies and gentlemen, you can donate through KiwiBank, PayPal, or Patreon. And if you want to sign up and donate regularly, ladies and gentlemen, that is very much appreciated as well. And the rewards you get a big unlisted playlist with a whole bunch of very, very dangerous videos that are not allowed to be public, and a secret Vinny Eastwood Donors Facebook group where you get all the notifications for all the shows that come up. And you can suggest a guest. So if you want to bring somebody on the show, we'll do that. So with that said, and as they say in Israel, without further ado, Dr. Bob Melamede, please introduce yourself and what it is you do.
Hi, I'm a retired molecular geneticist, immunologist, whatever, in that whole realm of modern biology. And since I've been retired, I've really had more fun and learned more and worked harder than ever in my life. And fortunately, I've discovered some very important basic things, specifically really the physics that underlies biology. So that by understanding some of the things that I'm sure we'll touch on, you can start to actually have a rational understanding of what health is and what things we can do to promote it or what things we do that impair our health. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I got a lot of cannabis-related businesses that I've funded around the world in one way or another, and waiting for all of that to come to fruition once the world wakes up to the cannabis awakening that is spreading and will continue to spread because it is the truth.
I have difficulty believing that the truth just spreads like that, kind of thing. It's not a very popular thing. And I recall having a conversation with a friend of my wife's, and it got heated and hostile very, very quickly. And it ended with, if you keep saying things like that, Vinny, you're talking about cannabis as some kind of miracle plant, and it just discredits the whole movement. And it's like, well hold on a second. If it's the truth, how is that discrediting? Because if you're not telling the truth, aren't you lying? And is lying not discrediting you? I don't know what your thoughts are on that. But today we're sponsored by the New Zealand Public Party, Reclaiming New Zealand for All the People. And I was wondering, Bob, did you have a chance to look at the website or anything like that first?
Very, very briefly. So, hit me up with anything you'd like, and I'll respond as though I had.
Okay. Well, the question here is, what would your advice be, just in terms of national policy? Because we live in a very globalized world now, and what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And so, if you have a look at the health problems and things of that nature where you're living in the United States, you would probably understand that the very similar health problems exist here in New Zealand, both systemically within the national government level, as well as internationally with giant pharmaceutical companies. So I'm wondering, wondering, with your research into cannabis, molecular biology, and all of that stuff, what do you think politicians actually need to start learning about, knowing about, if they want to draft any policy that's actually going to help and heal people?
Well, I think the biggest problem really kind of centers around the United States because of our economic and military might. We were kind of a go-to country for a lot of innovation and insight, over the past, say, 100 years for many reasons. But unfortunately, we led the world astray because basically what happened was the oil industry, run and ruled by the Rockefellers, became the pharmaceutical industry because you could make pharmaceuticals out of oil. So as that chemistry evolved and money was to be made, you don't have to put it as a negative conspiracy, although there certainly are very likely elements to that. But that aside, the world was progressing, and we had oil, and we had new knowledge, and we had ways of putting our molecules together and exploring options. So it was kind of natural, I think, to assume that our knowledge and our ability would provide us with medical health solutions. Unfortunately, that's really not what happened, because what we did was we tried to address symptoms, and we tried to address symptoms in a way that is fundamentally wrong. We tried to address symptoms by making chemicals that were not part of life's flow, but that could impact on imbalances that were giving us, illnesses and symptoms. The problem with that approach is the chemicals that are part of us are part of this flowing continuity. It's like a big psychedelic vision where everything flows and transforms into everything else. And there's a harmony. Even if you're out of whack and sick, there's still a harmony to the flow of life. And because of that, you want to guide the flow rather than try to kind of replace it with these synthetic chemicals that you had to create, because if they weren't synthetic, you couldn't patent them. And then you didn't have the protection that people wanted, because the whole system is really not about creating health. It's about creating wealth. So therein lies the essence of the problem. Our entire healthcare system is really a wealth care system designed to make money for the people who are basically deceiving us through their own ignorance or our ignorance or both, or who knows. It doesn't matter. The point is there are alternatives, science-based alternatives, that address many of the confusing issues that arise when you base your medicine on science that's incomplete. Because if you don't understand the foundation and you start in the middle, and then you try to, achieve some success without knowing what's going on, the likelihood of success is very small. And hence you see the long list of side effects that goes with every pharmaceutical.
So let's talk about that just in general. Why do you think that pharmaceuticals do what they do versus other methodologies, right? Because I think, what was it, the two sins in medicine, one of them is to kill the patient and the other is to cure the patient.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think that is?
I'm sorry, repeat the question so that I can actually answer it.
Well, it's said in medicine that there are only two sins, to kill the patient and to cure the patient. Now, why is that, and what could be done to change that level of consciousness within that industry?
All right, so once again, the whole concept of wealth care is flawed, because if your decision making is driven by money rather than the desired outcome of restoring health, then you get out of kilter. And that's a natural state, unfortunately, because we don't have the physics, the understanding based on physics that allows us to extrapolate fundamental phenomena into living systems so that we can say, these particular characteristics on a physical, chemical level are what account for health. And if you have this disease or that disease, whatever your particular imbalance is, the idea is how do you restore balance? And if you don't understand the nature of creation and you live in this fantasy world because you don't understand the origins of life, so you're starting midway through the book and you're trying to assume enough knowledge that you can, write a happy ending. It don't work that way.
So when it comes to treating disease and things of that nature, what diseases have you found that could actually have a better improved healthcare schedule?
All diseases, because what you have to understand is how life works. So let's spend a little time, because the concepts are not hard as long as you're not a biomedical expert. Then the concepts, your brain just shuts down and you can't understand it. But if you're a normal person with intelligence, you can understand quite clearly what I'm about to tell you. So the basic principle, the basic reality of all living systems, from the smallest to the biggest, is that flowing energy organizes matter. And it organizes matter in such a way that there's always a balance of opposing forces. And that flow that creates this increased complexity that occurs with time as flowing energy flows and organizes matter. It starts simple and it keeps evolving. So you go from very simple molecules when the Earth first formed, and the heat of the Earth and the sunlight naturally generates a higher level of complexity. That's basically an equilibrium phenomena, because if there are possibilities for molecular distribution that can occur randomly over time, they will occur. So that generates molecular diversity. But that has nothing to do really yet with life. It's just giving you some raw materials so that you can start to build things, because now you at least have something more than the simplest of things. You have some things that are different, so you can start to assemble things with differences and create greater complexity. That's the key to understanding evolution. It's a process by which this flowing energy builds complexity. And the magic is that it always does that by balancing opposing forces. And in all living systems, the balance that occurs is between carbohydrate metabolism that pushes us into the future. Life and evolution is not an accident. It's actually squeezed out of time by the flowing energy building complexity. And as the complexity of the prebiotic soup increased, a critical point was reached and a phenomena known as a far from equilibrium phase change occurred. The way liquid forms ice, for example. That's a static example. What I'm talking about is a dynamic example of that phenomena. So we should take a moment and look at, what do I mean by a flow-dependent structure? Because that's what I'm telling you now. The complexity of chemicals that naturally occurred, once that's there and energy flows through that complexity, it can generate more complexity. But the more complexity is dependent on the constant flow of the energy, and how that balance is balanced and occurs by balancing opposing forces. So the big trick here is carbohydrates push us into the future and build complexity. But as that energy from metabolism of carbohydrates, which means fats and sugars, starches, that whole collection, proteins, those are all, they're hydrocarbons, and if you add an amino group, you got amino acids. So that whole collection of things has a whole complex flow, like a psychedelic hallucination, of ever-changing, flowing biochemistry that builds us into the future. Because as we do our thing and build ourselves, we interact with the environment and we change the environment. Well, now, in order for us to be compatible with the environment, we now have to be changed by the environment. And that process goes on and on and on and on. So, what I'm really describing is what I call a dynamic, adaptable fractal. And that's really the essence of what life is from the physics perspective. It's constantly adapting and changing the environment that's changing it, that changes the environment, always flowing energy, always balancing the damage that's done by this carbohydrate building by repair, by recycling. And the amazing thing is that all occurs by fat burning. This is incredible. It's not taught in our medical schools. And we'll I'll freak you out even more once we learn a little bit more here. So what things happen in fat burning? Well, there is this recycling of damages. And what's the nature of the damages that occur in a cell? Well, they're chemical modifications, literally to every chemical possible within a cell. And how does that happen? It happens because we make, as part of our carbohydrate metabolism, free radicals. And those free radicals are very reactive chemicals that can react with everything that's in us, our proteins, our fats, our carbohydrates, our, everything that we are can be modified. And when you modify something, it doesn't work the same as when it wasn't modified. You see, now it can't fit into the flow the same way that it originally did. But because it's part of the natural flow of life's experience, what has happened in the evolving complexity over time is that the system, the collection of molecules that constitutes any living entity, or the collection of all of them, that balancing act has to always be occurring so that the collection of molecules doesn't basically discharge the complexity of life. And what happens as we age is free radicals keep modifying our complexity. And because we don't burn enough fat and we consume too many carbohydrates, we accumulate these damaged chemicals that impair the quality, the purity of our flow that would be occurring if we were not overloading our capacity to deal with free radicals. So it's that overload that deteriorates the integrity of our system, and that's what aging is. And depending on an individual and their genetics, and we'll get into what genetics really means, depending on an individual's history and their genetics, they're going to have a unique their flow that is going to, over time, bring them closer to equilibrium, at which point they will reach a far from equilibrium phase change that unlifes them. It's called death. So now the system can't take in enough negative entropy, information, and chemical potential from the environment to maintain the organization of the structure, the individual. Does that make sense?
Not at all.
It does to me.
So there's two things I want to discuss there based on that. Then is one is Dr. Robert Young. He talked about the interstitial fluids of the interstitium, which he claims is the largest organ in the body, and you can work at it like this. Let's say you've got a fish in water. What happens if you add a whole bunch of salt to that water? If it's a freshwater fish die, right? And your whole body's made of water. So imagine what happens when you put a whole bunch of toxins into your bloodstream, into the interstitial fluids of the interstitium. What's going to happen to you then? You're going to accrue all of these diseases and things of that nature. And the second point...
Well, what does that really mean? You see, when you say put these things in and accrue these illnesses, what does that mean? Those are words, but there's a reality underlying that. And that's what I'm trying to get at and describe, so that we can start to have a universal language to describe the underlying of any illness. And then it's simply a matter of using that underlying understanding to see the specific implementation in any particular circumstance: diabetes, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, whatever. How does the flowing energy that is balancing carbohydrate metabolism with fat metabolism, how does that manifest as our health or our illness? as our youth, our vitality, or our aging. That's what I, want to discuss, because
Sure.
that's what we are missing in our understanding. And it's without understanding that everything we do on a pharmaceutical level is really bullshit, because if you don't understand how something is being created and made, and you're trying to modify it, it's like you have a blindfold on, so the chance of success is pretty low. And that's why, again, we have all of these side effects, because they're trying to address symptoms, because that's what they're seeing. People go and complain, oh, I have this symptom. They're not complaining that that symptom manifests after, them having a particular imbalance for 5 years that became a particular thing, or 20 years, or 50 years, or 60 years, or 70 years. You keep feeding the imbalance, and it grows until it reaches a point where you say, oh, shit. And then you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, well, we'll give you this medicine because the FDA has determined that it has clinical efficacy in a double-blind clinical trial study. And you take it, and you hope that, you get some relief that's, more functional than side effects that you're going to be building over time, because you're perturbing the flow of the system. You're not perturbing it based on knowledge and an effort to recreate some healthy flow. Now you're pissing in the wind, and you're hoping that the wind's blowing in the correct direction, that you're not pissing on yourself. But we piss on ourselves all the time. That's what Big Pharma does.
Well, I came up with a bit of a discovery one time, and it was like, human beings age and die for the same reason that cars rust and die. Oxidation, right? And the way to
Yes,
stop
but
that, and the way to stop that is with antioxidants. And the way I understood it was, you've got these things called free radicals, and they steal your electrons. Now, they're essentially the psychopaths of the microscopic fractal world. And you've got these
no,
things
we are
called
the
if I
psychopaths.
may, and then there's these things called antioxidants, which are kind of like the activists of the microscopic fractal world. So what happens is, you'll have a free radical come along. He'll see a healthy cell, and he'll be like, "Ooh, you've got some nice electrons, don't you? Why don't we just come up over real close to you and now snatch it?" Yeah! And then the cell's damaged, and he's like, "Oh my God, it's still my electrons." And then this antioxidant comes in. He sees this guy, his cell's like flopping around, is all damaged and stuff, and he goes, "Hey, buddy, are you all right? What happened to you?" This free radical, he's still my electrons. And the antioxidant's like, "Hey, buddy, I've got a couple for you. Here you go. Here you go. Is that better? Is that better?" Oh, yeah. No. All right, so that's basically how we get old and die, is we've got essentially these microscopic fractal psychopaths that are trying to kill us and thief our stuff all the time, right? That's how I understood it.
Well, you're voicing really the standard model of how we perceive biology. And that's exactly what I want to undo in this conversation. Because basically what you're saying is that somehow, miraculously, we are here. And as we age, and we don't describe what that is, but as we age, these free radicals are screwing us up, because we keep accumulating these damaged pieces. That's the static view. And from a static view, where you say, well, what's the probability of this happening, the probability of that happening? If you look at a static view of life, and you say, what's the probability of making one average protein of 100 amino acids?
It's impossible.
Well, it would be 1 out of 20, 1 out of 20, 100 times. And that number is larger than the number of particles in the universe.
Yeah.
So to make one protein is impossible, ridiculous. And here we're composed of, thousands of these proteins that are interacting in a harmony to keep us alive. So the probability of that becomes essentially zero. But we're here. So now you're stuck with saying either we don't understand something and our way of thinking is wrong, or our way of thinking is right and we'll just go back to a beginning that we don't understand. We'll ignore that we don't understand it, or we'll place faith in God and say that God made it happen. So, what I really would like to do is describe my version of God and how everything happened, and how, by understanding that, we can understand what we are, how we got here, where we might actually go, and it's all a fun trip.
Sure.
So that's what I'd like to be able to do. But in right off the bat, because so everybody understands that when vertebrates first appeared, and we can go before life and we can lead to the protozoa single cells, and we can go evolving with the vertebrates. And you know, if we have time, we'll do all of that. But something special happened when the vertebrates happened. And that was a new way to drive the system, meaning energy flow. How do we get energy flow? We eat it, right? But how is there food for us to eat? Well, ultimately, some life forms are able to capture the sunlight and turn it into life, and then ultimately we eat it downstream somewhere along the line. And every time we get hungry because endocannabinoids are produced in our brain that give us the munchies, the same way as if you smoked a joint. And where I'm going with this is that's very fundamental, because that's what gives us the energy for the flow. But beyond that, what's so amazing is that our endocannabinoid system, the cannabis from within that we all produce, what's so incredible is that that endocannabinoid system literally regulates everything in our body from conception until death. So that's pretty amazing. That's pretty significant. And once you start to understand how it does that, then you understand how cannabis has this incredible capacity to promote health. So rather than having the ignorant big pharma approach because you don't know what you're talking about and saying, oh, how can anything possibly have so many effects? If you understood the reality that I'm trying to describe to you, you would understand that the endocannabinoid system is the master regulator of everything. And that ultimately what everything is regulating, when you really get down to the nitty gritty, down to the basics, is that is regulating free radicals. Because as you said, those free radicals react with everything and they screw things up. But what they're screwing up is not something that's static. They're screwing up the flow. So we're always making free radicals and we're always fixing the damages that they create. That's the flow. We're always taking in oxygen and breathing out CO2 and water. Well, all of that C came from all the carbons we ate and the food we ate. And all of the O came from the oxygen we breathed. And in that process, we generated the energy that powers the flow, the production of ATP. And as you make complexity, you want to have a greater ability to make energy efficiently. I mean, just look today. What do we try to do? We want to have more efficient batteries, more efficient cars. You always want more efficient energy because then you can do more and you can do it better. And ideally, you want to do it safer. You know, we want to live in a society where we have all the energy we want, but we don't want to be poisoning ourselves and the planet in the process. And that's another discussion, but there are new technologies that will allow that to all happen.
Yeah, well,
But in the
as you were
meantime,
saying, and I want to just illustrate a point that you made earlier, is how long the endocannabinoid system has been around. And this here is part one of a document by Ray Chanmugam, and he talks about the length of time that the endocannabinoid system has actually been around, found in vertebrates at the beginning of the Triassic era, 250 million years ago. this is a massive important part of the evolution, not just of human beings per se, but of all organisms past that point, and possibly before as well.
Well, before as well, in the sense that the endocannabinoid chemicals that were part of the evolving complexity of the evolving vertebrates that came first from the prokaryotes, the bacteria that were able to photosynthesize in the early atmosphere, where the sunlight in a hydrogen-nitrogen atmosphere drove complexity that allowed for the far from equilibrium phase change that spontaneously then emerged as life, powered by the photosynthesis as well as chemosynthetic organisms using chemistry from the planet itself. And as that complexity evolved, for 1 billion years, what happened was, you had life and death for 1 billion years. So after 1 billion years, two things happened. Remember, you're always changing the environment, right? Well, those bacteria changed their environment. They made oxygen. And they also made a lot of hydrocarbon corpses. So now you had something you could burn with oxygen. Now you had food. So now new types of cells evolved, a higher level of complexity, driven, not by accident, driven, pushed into the future by flowing energy. And when you have sufficient flowing energy, you keep making more and more complexity. It's like what we do in our society.
Well, speaking of which, that is a great segue to do a wee plug for myself. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a listener-supported show. It's supporting the flow of information. So go and donate at the VinnyEastwoodShow.com. KiwiBank, PayPal or Patreon options available. And if you do donate, ladies and gentlemen, you can get into the secret Vinny Eastwood flow tap frickin' Facebook group that we've got, and indeed there's a unlisted playlist as well. Now, if you already have donated and you don't know where those rewards are, on the homepage of the VinnyEastwoodShow.com, that's Vinny with a Y because it's the most important question, Eastwood like go ahead, make more news, there's a little thing that just says, have you already donated? Click here to get your special rewards. So go ahead and do that, ladies and gentlemen, and please like this video and share it around. We still have about 30 minutes left in the broadcast. Sorry to interrupt, Bob, but I thought it was just a too juicy a segue to pass up.
That's exactly what we're talking about, how the environment, our exchange, our words led into a creative enterprise there to change in the direction and utilize the flow, put out a point of energy, and information, and now we anchored back again. Yeah. So that brings up what I started to talk about earlier and I forgot to talk about. It's so important for everyone to understand the concept of a flow-dependent structure, because the physics that underlies what I'm talking about was discovered and created by Dr. Ilya Prigogine. He got his PhD in 1947, the year that I was born. And he created an entire new field of physics called far from equilibrium thermodynamics. So far from equilibrium means that something has potential. It's like a charged battery that has potential, and it can do something. Whereas once the battery is discharged, the potential is lost and it can't do anything. So that's what we're talking about in a chemical sense, that flowing energy extracted from the environment will create structures that are flow-dependent structures. The structures only exist as long as the flow comes from the environment. So there are many sources of potential. And I'm going to describe a very simple one generated by gravity that everyone is familiar with. And then we'll use that as a model for understanding how, instead of using gravity, we could use chemistry to accomplish a related task that can then organize molecules to create complexity, to create evolution, to create us, to create our consciousness, to create our society, to create our biosphere. It's all part of one big chemical complex flow. Yeah. So think of a bathtub. you have the bathtub full and you pull the plug. And, it keeps going down and down and down. And all of a sudden it reaches a critical point where you start to form a whirlpool. Now, think of what that really means. That means that at some point, driven by gravity, the molecules in that dumb, random water decided, quote, to no longer be random. And that if they cooperate, they can actually accomplish God's will, make the water drain faster. In other words, have gravity deplete its potential more rapidly by creating an organized structure. That's exactly what we are. But we're not powered by gravity, we're powered by chemical flow that had its origins really in the sunlight.
Or electron flow rather than chemical, right? Because we're electrical
Well, no,
beings.
that's what we're talking about. Electron flow from chemicals. You see, you can have electron flow like electricity, where you have, a copper wire, for example, and the electrons just, go from one atom to the other very freely, as long as you put in the potential provided by, your voltage. Well, it's a similar kind of a phenomena that's happening in all living systems. But what we do is, instead of having a plus and a minus with electrons driven by like a battery or chemical reaction or magnets, for a generator, what we have is electrons that are trapped in molecules that were forced there by trapping the energy of the sunlight to make the hydrocarbons. That's what photosynthesis is. And then we ultimately eat the photosynthesis either directly in the form of the plants we eat or indirectly in the form of the animals that we eat. So what we now have is chemical potential that was trapped. It's like gasoline. What we basically are doing, instead of burning gasoline to drive a motor or to make, a fire, we use that same chemical potential and we degrade it in a very controlled fashion by the enzymes that we make that were coded in the DNA. And where I want to go ultimately is, where did that DNA come from and what is that DNA really doing? Because what if we are wrong about the most fundamental aspects of our understanding of evolution and how it came about and what's really going on?
Well, I imagine
that's true.
I imagine if we were wrong, there'd be an awful lot of cognitive dissonance, an awful lot of name calling, and an awful lot of turning the back and walking away. I mean, that's what happens when people are wrong, generally speaking.
Well, that's
which
why
reminds me to ask you to bring up 2 points here: the blips and flips, as you've informed me of, and then on to Rick Simpson. But finish your point first.
Now you expect me to remember what my point was? My point was that flowing energy organizes matter into these flow-dependent structures. And in the case of the bathtub, we see a physical example of how potential in the form of gravity creates structure. And in the case of living systems like us, we eat our hydrocarbons, and that has the energy already trapped in them. So we're basically burning hydrocarbons in a controlled fashion, and that's how we make our ATP. And when we do that, we can make our energy efficiently, like a nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor is a great tool as long as it doesn't screw up. As soon as it screws up, you're in big trouble, right? Well, we have a similar factor going on inside of all of our cells. In our mitochondria, which are the energy powerhouses of our cell, part of the energy that we generate is made very efficiently by what's called the electron transport system. And that's like the nuclear reactor. And as long as it's working perfectly, it's great. But if you overfeed it, it's like overfueling a nuclear reactor and having it leak. That's what we're doing. We're overfueling the nuclear reactor in us with hydrocarbons, carbohydrates, sugar, proteins, in particular meaning sugars, carbohydrates. but proteins as well, and fats can feed into a common mill. But the big deal really is those carbohydrates, because they feed this electron transport system that when there's any imbalance in the flow, you know, any imbalance in this multi-dimensional hallucination, what it will then do is generate free radicals. And we are designed to stop that from happening. On the one hand, we have molecules that quench them, like vitamin C and various other ones, where the chemical interacts with the free radical, and then the free radical is no longer a problem. So that's one way of dealing with free radicals. That's kind of the first line of defense, like our vitamin C, and also, very importantly, a molecule called glutathione, which is very abundant in our lungs and is a major antioxidant because our lungs are full of oxygen. And oxygen has a tendency to produce free radicals and pro-oxidant chemistry that then has this damaging effect. So glutathione interacts with free radicals and with their products in terms of modified proteins, et cetera, and keeps things working correctly. But every molecule of glutathione can only work one time, and then it needs to be recharged for it to work again. And there's a molecule called N-acetylcysteine, NAC, and you can buy it in health food stores, Amazon, supermarkets frequently. And what NAC does is it recharges glutathione, which, remember then, is the antioxidant and the major antioxidant in your lungs. And it is the key to eliminating the problem with COVID. And yet it's ignored.
I feel a lot of affinity for glutathione because it's kind of like when you interview people who are very, very traumatized, they drain you and you need to recharge. So in that way, me and glutathione are much alike. So the question is, if this is a kind of like a fractal thing to a large degree, I think that's what's true on one level will be true on many other levels. So you're talking about the absolute microscopic, the tiniest of the tiny, the everything level, and then as soon as you go up the level and you go into human interactions and things of that nature, you'll actually start to see these exact same patterns repeating, can't you?
Exactly. In terms of if we go to the highest level, it's the difference between love, which is cooperation, because remember how we started this, molecules cooperated, and then they formed a whirlpool of a bathtub, or chemically they cooperated and changed evolution, made evolution, and we need to do the same thing on an individual level. And the hierarchy of this dynamic adaptive fractal that is the biosphere is our society. And the same is within ourselves. If we create too much pollution in our bodies, in our cells, in our minds, in our society, then we bring down the opportunities that come from enhanced cooperativity, which is the opposite. So we need to basically minimize the friction of life, which is what happens when you have an excess of free radicals.
Yeah, so we're
And
sick.
we do that by getting smarter.
So we're sick on a societal, macro, micro, and physical level to a large degree because essentially the flow has been interrupted in almost every way. Now that's another thing I wanted to then go on from that in terms of a segue is your explanation of blips and flips, the forward-looking people and the backward-looking people. Could you explain that for the audience?
Well, you see, that's a perfect segue, really, for where we just came from.
That's why they gave me the gig.
Yeah, I know. That's why you get paid the big bucks, man. You got a brain there. Shame on you. What happens is we keep getting smarter. You got to understand that once the CB1 receptor evolved with vertebrates, that squeezed more energy out of the electron transport system in a safe way by how the cannabinoid receptor regulated ion channels, in particular calcium, which when it enters and is used within the mitochondria can be a very strong activator. And when used in excess, actually can cause cell death and mitochondrial death, essentially, by creating too many free radicals. So what you have to do is you have to carefully regulate that nuclear reactor. And that's what the CB1 receptor does. It's not only on the membrane of cells, it's actually on the membrane of mitochondria. These are mitochondria at one point in our evolutionary past were free living bacteria. And they happen to have evolved efficient ways of generating energy. And somewhere along the line, they were eaten by another bacteria, and the two got along well. And that became the eukaryotic cells that evolved into the multicellular organisms that eventually evolved the tube, where they evolved from, from the head first, the mouth opening in the ball that evolved to form the gastrointestinal tract, a mouth and an anus. And at some point, the complexity that was being squeezed out of by evolution, naturally, God, generalized open system dynamics, the flowing energy, okay? Everywhere, creating everything all the time, generalized open system dynamics. That's God.
But of course, in politicians, the mouth and the anus and their function is reversed.
Well, no, you hit on something very important, because that's what happened with vertebrates. It became reversed. We open ass first. That's part of the difference that occurred with the rearrangement in our whole development from the sperm and the egg, that came with the evolution of the CB1 receptor that powered the evolution of the vertebrate brain. So every time there's an increase in the brain, there's an increase in CB1 receptor activity. It's the number one receptor in the human brain.
And so when cannabis got made illegal, essentially we've gotten a lot of human-sized free radicals that have evolved and started to take over society and pollute it, essentially.
Well, that's the blips and the flips again. So blips are the backward-looking people who are cannabis deficient. If you're cannabis deficient, that means that you tend to be more uptight, because you're not adjusting well. See, what cannabis really does, it's an adaptogen. When you look at how power through the electron transport system pyramided complexity up through the human brain and created consciousness. So consciousness has to now be at the point where we understand the significance of cooperation, the significance of the physics that I'm talking about, so we can start to understand the nature of life and start to understand what health means, so we can create healthy individuals and a healthy society, rather than just by accident bouncing into the future, making up nonsense medicines because you think you can interrupt, some symptom, rather than addressing the underlying cause by learning at an early age the nature of what I'm talking about today.
So is that why my father never evolved as an alcoholic? Because instead of using cannabis, which is an adaptogen, he used gin and didn't adapt.
Exactly. Well, it's even worse, because you see, alcohol promotes free radicals. So it's promoting excess carbohydrate consumption. It itself is a carbohydrate, and it's also a very toxic one. So the perturbation to the flow generates a lot of excess free radicals, promoting aging and promoting deterioration of the complexity of the consciousness, which leads to the violence and the stupidity associated with alcoholism.
So that the concept we're looking at here is somebody who's unable to see the future that doesn't exist yet, and the only thing that they can see is the past. As you described to me once, it's a human being that's driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror only and avoiding looking through the windshield, and it goes exactly as well as you'd expect.
It's so pathetic, but it's very natural, because think about it. If you don't make enough cannabinoids, and everybody knows, cannabis relaxes you, right? It makes you open-minded. It makes you retrospective. It makes you introspective. It enhances our ability to flow into the future. Well, if you're deficient in that, that means change is going to be stressful for you beyond if you had more cannabinoids. You see, any change, whether it be good change or bad change, means the flow has to adjust. So it's therefore stressful. But if you're cannabinoid endowed and you're positive in your life and your environment, then your flow and your changes are anticipated to be more positive, because you're involved in growth of yourself, of your family, of your community, of your society, of your environment. You see, you're part of God's will. the healthy flowing promotion of increased complexity. Whereas if you're uptight and cannabinoid deficient, your understanding is that you're afraid of change, so you want to minimize change. So you want to control everything because then you think you won't be stressed by the future because you're not allowing change, you're controlling it. And these are the people who naturally congregate in government. They're the rule makers who want to tell everybody else how to run their lives because of their mental illness. You know, they don't understand what freedom is. You know, they all need to take a good dose of LSD and wake up.
You know, I can't recommend that strongly enough. Now, the last 10 minutes that that we've got here. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a large acid supply and want to dip that into the coffee decanter in Parliament or something like that, go right ahead. I'm joking. But let's spend the last 10 minutes that we've got here speaking about Rick Simpson. Now, I've sent him a message this morning trying to get him on the show as well, but as I understand it, he's getting on, and time's really tough. But his research and his discoveries of the cannabinoids and things of that nature is quite significant. And you've worked with him fairly closely at points in your career, so I would love you to give a little bit of an explanation of who Rick Simpson is and what he does.
Rick Simpson's, quite a character, and he discovered along the way that he could cure his cancer with cannabis. Making oil, and along the way, with the cooperation of Phoenix Tears, the video was made, "Run from the Cure." And
by the way, ladies and gentlemen, sorry to interrupt. You can watch "Run from the Cure" on this channel, ladies and gentlemen. Just go to the channel and search in videos and search "Run for the Cure." Very, very important documentary. Bob, continue.
Yeah, so Rick was very, very important in awakening the world to the possibility, which in fact is an absolute reality, the possibility at that time that cannabis could cure cancer. And, the really sad, pathetic truth is that fundamental science, peer-reviewed science showed that back in the 1970s, and you would have thought that would have been jumped on and expanded upon, but it was instead quenched and hidden until 1997, when Manuel Guzman published an article that showed THC could kill glioma cells. So those decades were lost because goddamn big pharma controlled the government, and we have wealth care, not health care. And everybody who has died from cancer should remember that they have not been and still are not your friend. And cannabis is your friend, because you have an endocannabinoid system that has been involved in your creation. What better way to modify your flow for health, no matter what your illness is?
Yes, and this is the origin of the saying, "A friend with weed is a friend indeed." And the reason why doctors are basically so anti-cannabis to a large degree is they're a little annoyed that a cannabinoid can do a little bit more than they can.
There's a lot of ego. There's a lot of misinformation. They're not educated. So even those with good intent have been indoctrinated by the fear and the ignorance of the big pharma approach. So we have a stagnation. We have like a mental illness in society that keeps that sickness. It's hard to break that momentum, because you have ignorance at all levels. See, that's why it's so important that we have the activists around the world, because they understand the physics of life that I talk about. That's what I do. I go around and I explain this around the world, and to the activists who are already implementing the knowledge by virtue of how you help people. If you have somebody with MS, and we have one guy that got up out of the wheelchair, 100% disabled, and he runs, and jumps rope because he uses cannabis. We have people, terminal cancer, completely eliminated. It doesn't mean it works all the time, but it means that you are making an approach to health based on how we evolved. And what we need to ultimately do is to understand the individual nature of a person's imbalance and help restore that. But in general, all of us suffer an imbalance of excess carbohydrate consumption, and you can reverse the progress of your aging and, in fact, reverse your aging to a significant degree by moving yourself further from equilibrium and learning what that means and eating and thinking and living accordingly. And I can speak from my personal point of view. I'm 72 years old, and I feel a lot younger today than I did 5 years ago, for example. In 2014, I had heart failure from my arrhythmia, and I've reversed all of that crap, and I feel wonderful. So we can do things. I mean, now I'm working on rebuilding my hip because I'm not going to get it replaced. I'm going to generate a new one. And I believe it can be done. As a matter of fact, I believe my science says it must be done. You see, it's all about the flow.
You're
and
right.
The flow
you're
is
right.
regulated by your mind and your behavior.
And that brings me on to last points. We've only got about 5 minutes left in the show, but nobody can make you healthy. You have to make you healthy, right? Like nobody can go to the bathroom for you. No. It's just like that. You've got to get out of bed and you've got to do it yourself. And we talk about how we've got a sick society, and it's incredibly self-evident to a large degree by every single measure of even physical health, mental health, or financial health. Everybody's sick with either debt, diseases, or psychosis to a large degree. It's absolutely self-evident. And as we talked about earlier, the activists and things of that nature, shows like this, we are the electron givers. We are the ones who are actually healing. We are the ones who are making society move forward in a less corrosive manner, a less destructive manner. And when other people see it and they see that they're not the only ones talking and thinking about this kind of thing, they get given energy from it. And that's what a lot of the listeners have said, that sometimes when you're really, really down, when you're really, really depressed, just seeing somebody who talks like you, who thinks like you, who does the things that you want to be seen doing, it restores your faith in humanity. It gives you a spiritual balance to a large degree. We're recharging the people, I think, Bob.
We have to recharge ourselves by understanding our own personal responsibility. Because what I'm talking about is developing the consciousness and the understanding that you know what it means to eat correctly and why you must exercise and why you must keep acquiring knowledge and understanding, but why all of those things must be done within the context of love, friendliness, cooperation, and mutual help for all of us to move into a future, THC, total health care.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes the current medical system obsolete, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So let's say, ladies and gentlemen, think about this to a large degree, as much as you can. What am I doing in my own life that's making me sick, and how can I change my own habits? Because you can't do the whole government thing and just go, hey, look, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. Government, I don't believe, has a really moral right to exist to a large degree, but if it does exist, its role should be purely advice. Like, this is what all these guys say, you could do this or you cannot. But I think that government has a very, very poor track record of telling the people the truth and giving them sound advice. But in either case, the entire point of the show is here behind New Zealand Public Party is to reclaim New Zealand for all the people. And over here we have the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is my little baby Alina. I'm just going to play this little 10-second clip for you folks so you can see the cuteness for yourself.
My mama loves us. Daddy loves you so much because you're just so cute. All right, that's enough. That's enough.
Now, hopefully, breastfed.
Yes, very much so. It's quite funny because my wife is rather well endowed, and so when she was first feeding the baby, it was like like those mini footballs. It was like a mini football feeding off of two basketballs. It was quite funny, actually.
But you were providing psychoactive cannabinoids to that newborn to help stimulate its appetite, to help adjust it to the new oxygen levels, protect its brain from all that new oxygen, to make it comfortable, bond with its mother, and sleep comfortably. You got the baby stoned. Women evolved breasts so they could get their baby stoned because it was a good thing for the babies and it's a good thing for all of us. It's an anti-aging nutritional compound. All illnesses that it helps are nutritional deficiencies in cannabis activity.
Yeah, the amount of problems that can be solved by boobies alone, ladies and gentlemen, you would not believe.
Yes, onward and upward.
Yeah. I mean, it could be worse. All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob, for your time and expertise today. And do you have a website or something of that nature that people might be able to visit?
I do. I have Canna Sapiens, CANNA-sapiens.com. You need a dash there after the Canna. Canna-Sapiens.
Canna-Sapiens. There we are.
And then I'm working with a friend who's trying to make me polite looking so that people will learn my science. And that's on...
how's that working out for him?
Well, they're cleaning up my act and putting it into a website that's less confusing than mine, because mine represents my confused brain. So if you go to CBD for Seniors and Blue Ribbon CBD, that's part of this effort to, change the world by providing people with high quality cannabinoids at affordable prices while educating them at the same time.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bob Melamede, for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, once more, just if you've enjoyed this episode, give it a wee like. If you've really enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. More episodes are coming every single day, ladies and gentlemen. Well, every working day of the week anyway. And the idea behind this month's programming is to get in international experts and local experts, for that matter, on a range of different subjects, a range of different fields of expertise, to just basically clue you up about the stuff that you may not know already. Because if you're informed, you're far more difficult to deceive. Bob, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure. Ciao.
That being said, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to the Vinny Eastwood Show. You can support us on the homepage of the VinnyEastwoodShow.com. That's Vinny with a Y, because it's the most important question. And Eastwood, go ahead, make my news. And you can donate through the Patreon, PayPal, and also KiwiBank as well. Now, just before we go, I really do want to thank all the mods in the chat room. We had Amos777 and Jimmy James and Anti-Gubernare and a number of other mods as well who've been participating in the show today. D. McLaughlin as well. Thank you guys so much for regulating the chat and keeping the old riff-raff out. And I also want to personally thank every single person who donates to the Vinny Eastwood Show. It is very, very difficult supporting your wife and your baby on an activist's income, ladies and gentlemen. You haven't paid to listen to this show, and that is not why you do it. You do it because I've already done the work, and you appreciate it, and it is making the world a better place, and you want that to continue. It is called the peer-to-peer economy, ladies and gentlemen. There aren't winners, there aren't losers, everybody wins. Well, thank you very much for listening to the Vinny Eastwood Show, the lighter side of genocide. Just because we're being exterminated doesn't mean we can't make it fun. Otherwise, what's the point of being killed? The Vinny Eastwood Show, where the only thing worse than living in a high-tech global police state is Vinny's jokes.